Hello, everybody. Happy Halloween. My name is Patrick Raymond. I'm the Adult Services Librarian at the Bonnie Lake Branch. Thank you for joining me for this special edition of Pierce County Library System's virtual Halloween Storytime, Storytime for Grown-ups. In honor of Halloween, I will be reading you 3 stories about a vexing vision, a pastel person, and a spooked scientist. I hope you enjoy them. The Pale Man, 1934, by Julius Long. A queer little tale about the eccentric behavior of a strange guest in a country hotel. I've not yet met the man in number 212. I do not even know his name. He never patronizes the hotel restaurant, and he does not use the lobby. On the 3 occasions when we passed each other, we did not speak, although we nodded in a semi-cordial, non-committal way. I should very much like to make his acquaintance. It is a lonesome in this dreary place. With the exception of the aged lady down the corridor, the only permanent guests are the man in number 212 and myself. However, I should not complain, for this utter quiet is precisely what the doctor prescribed. I wonder if the man in number 212 too has come here for a rest. He is so very pale. Yet I cannot believe that he is ill, for his paleness is not of a sickly cast, but rather wholesome in its ivory clarity. His carriage is that of a man enjoying the best health. He is tall and straight. He walks erectly and with a brisk athletic stride. His pallor is no doubt congenital, else he would tan quickly under this burning summer sun. He must have traveled here by auto, for he certainly was not a passenger on the train that brought me, and he checked in only a short time after my arrival. I had briefly rested in my room and was walking down the stairs when I encountered him ascending with his bag. It is odd that our venerable bellboy did not show him to his room. It is odd, too, that with so many vacant rooms in this hotel, he should have chosen number 212 at the extreme rear. The building is a long, narrow affair, 3 stories high. The rooms are all on the east side, as the west wall is flushed with a decrepit business building. The corridor is long and drab, and its stiff bloated paper exudes a musty, unpleasant odor. The feeble electric bulbs that light it shine as dimly as from a tomb. Revolted by this corridor, I insisted vigorously upon being given number 201, which is at the front and blessed with southern exposure. The room clerk, a disagreeable fellow with a Hitler mustache, was very reluctant to let me have it, as it ordinarily is reserved for his more profitable transient trade. I fear my stubborn insistence has made an enemy of him. If only I had been as self-assertive 30 years ago, I would now be a full-fledged professor instead of a broken-down assistant. I still smart from the cavalier manner in which the president of the university summarily recommended my vacation. No doubt he acted in my best interests. The people who have dominated my poor life invariably have. Oh well, the summer's rest will probably do me considerable good. It is pleasant to be away from the university. There is something positively gratifying about the absence of the graduate student face. If only I were not so lonely. I must devise a way of meeting the pale man in number 212. Perhaps the room clerk can arrange matters. I have been here exactly a week, and if there is a friendly soul in this miserable little town, he has escaped my notice. Although the tradespeople accept my money with flattering eagerness, they studiously avoid even the most casual conversation. I'm afraid I can never cultivate their society unless I can arrange to have my ancestors recognized as local residents for the last 150 years. Despite the coolness of my reception, I have been frequently venturing abroad. In the back of my mind, I have cherished hopes that I might encounter the pale man in number 211. Incidentally, I wonder why he has moved from number 212. There is certainly little advantage in coming only one room nearer in the front. I noticed the change yesterday when I saw him coming out of his new room. We nodded again, and this time I thought I detected a certain malign satisfaction in his somber black eyes. He must know that I am eager to make his acquaintance, yet his manner forbids overtures. If he wants to make me go all the way, he can go to the devil. I am not the sort to run after anybody. Indeed, it is the surly diffidence of the room clerk that has been enough to prevent me from questioning him about his mysterious guest. I wonder where the pale man takes his meals. I have been absenting myself from the hotel restaurant and patronizing the restaurants outside. At each I had ventured inquiries about the man in number 210. No one at any restaurant remembered him having been there. Perhaps he has entree into the Brahmin homes of this town. And again, he may have found a boarding house. I shall have to learn if there be one. The pale man must be difficult to please, for he has again changed his room. I am baffled by his conduct. He is no desirous of locating himself more conveniently in the hotel. Why does he not move to number 202, which is the nearest available room to the front? Perhaps I can make his inability to locate himself permanently an excuse for starting a conversation. I see we are closer neighbors now, I might casually say. But that is too banal. I must wait a better opportunity. He has done it again. He is now occupying number 209. I am intrigued by his little game. I waste hours trying to fathom its point. What possible motive could he have? I should think he would get on the hotel people's nerves. I wonder what our combination bellhop chambermaid thinks of having had to prepare 4 rooms for a single guest. If he were not stone deaf, I would ask him. At present, I feel too exhausted to attempt such an enervating conversation. I'm tremendously interested in the pale man's next move. He must either skip a room or remain where he is, for a permanent guest, a very old lady, occupies number 208. She has not budged from her room since I have been here, and I imagine that she does not intend to. Wonder what the pale man will do. I await his decision with the nervous excitement of a devotee of the track on the eve of a big race. After all, I have so little diversion. Well, the mysterious guest was not forced to remain where he was, nor did he have to skip a room. The lady in number 208 simplified matters by conveniently dying. No one knows the cause of death, but it is generally attributed to old age. She was buried this morning. I was among the curious few who attended her funeral. When I returned home from the mortuary, it was in time to see the pale man leaving her room. He has already moved in. He favored me with a smile, whose meaning I have tried in vain to decipher. I cannot but believe that he meant it to have some significance. He acted as if there were between us some secret that I failed to appreciate. But then perhaps the smile was meaningless after all, and only ambiguous by chance, like that of the Mona Lisa. My man of mystery now resides in number 207, and I am not the least surprised. I would have been astonished if he had not made this move. I've almost given up on trying to understand his eccentric conduct. I do not know a single thing more about him than I knew the day he arrived. I wonder whence he came. There is something indefinably foreign about his manner. I'm curious to hear his voice. I like to imagine that he speaks the exotic tongue of some faraway country. If only I could somehow inveigle him into conversation. I wish that I were possessed of the glib assurance of a college boy who can address himself to the most distinguished celebrity without batting an eye. It is no wonder that I'm only an assistant professor. I am worried. This morning I awoke to find myself lying prone upon the floor. I was fully clothed. I must have fallen exhausted there after I returned to my room last night. I wonder if my condition is more serious than I had suspected. Until now, I have been inclined to discount the fears of those who have pulled a long face about me. For the first time, I recall the prolonged hand clasp of the president when he bade me goodbye from the university. Obviously, he never expected to see me alive again. Of course, I am not that unwell. Nevertheless, I must be more careful. Thank heaven I have no dependents to worry about. I have not even a wife, for I was never willing to exchange the loneliness of a bachelor for the loneliness of a husband. I can say in all sincerity that the prospect of death does not frighten me. Speculation about life beyond the grave has always bored me. Whatever it is or is not, I'll try to get along. I have been so preoccupied about my sudden turn of my own affairs that I have neglected to make note of the most extraordinary incident. The pale man has done an astounding thing. He skipped 3 rooms and moved all the way to number 203. We are now very close neighbors. We shall meet oftener, and my chances of making his acquaintance are now greater. I have confined myself to bed during the last few days and have had my food brought to me. I even called a local doctor whom I suspected was a quack. He looked me over with professional indifference and told me not to leave my room. For some reason, he does not want me to climb stairs. For this bit of information, he received a $10 bill, which, as I directed him, he fished out of my coat pocket. A pickpocket would not have done it better. He had not been gone long when I was visited by the room clerk. That worthy suggested with a great show of kindly concern that I use the facilities of the local hospital. It was so modern and all that. With more firmness than I have been able to muster in a long time, I gave him to understand that I intended to remain where I am. Frowning sullenly, he retired. The doctor must have paused long enough downstairs to tell him a pretty story. It is obvious that he is afraid that I shall die in his best room. The pale man is up to his own old tricks. Last night when I pottered down the hall, the door of number 202 was ajar. Without thinking, I looked inside. The pale man sat in a rocking chair, idly smoking a cigarette. He looked into my eyes and smiled that peculiar, ambiguous smile that had so deeply puzzled me. I moved on down the corridor, not so much mystified as annoyed. The whole mystery of the man's conduct is beginning to irk me. It is all so inane, so utterly lacking in motive. I feel that I shall never meet the pale man, but at least I'm going to learn his identity. Tomorrow I shall ask for the room clerk, and deliberately interrogate him. I know now. I know the identity of the pale man, and I know the meaning of his smile. Early this afternoon I summoned the room clerk to my bedside. Please tell me, I asked abruptly, who is the man in number 202? The clerk stared wearily and uncomprehendingly. You must be mistaken. That room is unoccupied. Oh, but it is, I snapped in irritation. I saw myself, the man there, only 2 nights ago. He is tall and handsome, with dark hair and eyes. He is unusually pale. He checked in on the day that I arrived. The hotel man regarded me dubiously, as if I were trying to impose upon him. I assure you there is no such person in the house. As for his checking in when you did, you were the only guest we registered that day. What? Why, I've seen him 20 times. First he had number 212 at the end of the corridor, and then he kept moving towards the front. Now he's next door, number 202. The room clerk threw up his hands. You're crazy, he exclaimed. I saw that he meant what he said. I shut up at once and dismissed him. After he had gone, I heard him rattling the knob of the pale man's door. There is no doubt that he believes the room to be empty. Thus it is that I can now understand the events of the past few weeks. I now comprehend the significance of the death in number 207. I even feel partly responsible for the old lady's passing. After all, I brought the pale man with me. But it was not I who fixed his path. Why he had chose to approach me room after room through the length of this dreary hotel, why his path crossed the threshold of the woman in number 207, those mysteries I cannot explain. I suppose I should have guessed his identity when he skipped the 3 rooms the night I fell unconscious upon the floor. In a single night of triumph he advanced until he was almost to my door. He will be coming by and by to inhabit this room, his ultimate goal. When he comes, I shall at least be able to return his smile of grim recognition. Meanwhile, I only have to wait beyond my bolted door. The door swings slowly open. The end. The Signal Man, 1866, by Charles Dickens. Helloa! Hello there! When he heard a voice calling to him thus, he was standing at the door of his box, with a flag in his hand furled around its short pole. One would have thought, considering the nature of the ground, that he could not have doubted from what quarter the voice came. But instead of looking up to where I stood, at the top of the steep cutting nearly over his head, he turned himself about and looked down the line. There was something remarkable in his manner of doing so, though I could not have said for my life what. But I know it was remarkable enough to attract my notice, even though his figure was foreshortened and shadowed down in the deep trench, and mine was high above him, so steeped in the glow of an angry sunset that I had shaded my eyes with my hand before I saw him at all. Helloa, below! From looking down the line, he turned himself about again, and raising his eyes, saw my figure high above him. Is there any path by which I can come down and speak to you? He looked up at me without replying, and I looked down at him without pressing him too soon with a repetition of my idle question. Just then there came a vague vibration in the earth and air, quickly changing into a violent pulsation, and an oncoming rush that caused me to start back, as though it had force to draw me down. When such vapor as rose to my height from this rapid train had passed me, and was skimming away over the landscape, I looked down again, and saw him refurling the flag he had shown the train while it went by. I repeated my inquiry. After a pause, during which he seemed to regard me with fixed attention, he motioned with his rolled-up flag towards a point on my level, some 200 or 300 yards distant. I called down to him, "All right," and made for the point. There, by dint of looking closely about me, I found a rough zigzag descending path notched out, which I followed. The cutting was extremely deep and unusually precipitate. It was made through a clammy stone that became oozier and wetter as I went down. For these reasons, I found the way long enough to give me time to recall a singular air of reluctance or compulsion with which he had pointed out the path. When I came down low enough upon the zigzag descent to see him again, I saw that he was standing between the rails on the way by which the train had lately passed, in an attitude as if he were waiting for me to appear. He had his left hand at his chin, and that left elbow rested on his right hand, crossed over his breast. His attitude was one of such expectation and watchfulness that I stopped a moment, wondering at it. I resumed my downward way and stepped out upon the level of the railroad, and drawing nearer to him, saw that he was a dark, sallow man, with a dark beard and rather heavy eyebrows. His post was in as solitary and a dismal a place as I ever knew. On either side, a dripping wet wall of jagged stone, excluding all view but a strip of sky, the perspective one way only a crooked prolongation of this great dungeon, shorter perspective in the other direction, terminating in a gloomy red light and a gloomier entrance to a black tunnel, in whose massive architecture there was a barbarous, depressing, and forbidding air. So little sunlight ever found its way to this spot that it had an earthy, deadly smell, and so much cold wind rushed through it that it struck a chill to me, as if I had left the natural world. Before he stirred, I was near enough to him to have touched him. Not even then removing his eyes from mine, he stepped back one step and lifted his hand. This was a lonesome post to occupy, I said, and it had riveted my attention when I looked down from up yonder. A visitor was a rarity, I should suppose. Not an unwelcome rarity, I hoped. In me, he merely saw a man who had been shut up within the narrow limits all his life, and who, being at last set free, had a newly awakened interest in these great works. To such purpose I spoke to him, but I am far from sure of the terms I used, for, besides that I am not happy in opening any conversation, there was something in the man that daunted me. He directed a most curious look towards the red light near the tunnel's mouth, and looked all about at it, as if something were missing from it, and then he looked at me. That light was part of his charge, was it not? He answered in a low voice, "Don't you know it is?" The monstrous thought came into my mind as I perused the fixed eyes and the saturnine face, that this was a spirit, not a man. I have speculated since whether there may have been some infection in his mind. In my turn, I stepped back, but in making the action, I detected in his eyes some latent fear of me. This put the monstrous light. "You look at me," I said, forcing a smile, "as if you had a dread of me." "I was doubtful," he returned, "whether I had seen you before." "Where?" He pointed to the red light he had looked at. "There," I said. Intently watchful of me, he replied, but without a sound, "Yes." "My good fellow, what should I do there? However, be that as it may, I was never there, you may swear." "I think I may," he rejoined. "Yes, I am sure I may." His manner cleared, like my own. He replied to my remarks with readiness and in well-chosen words. Had he much to do there? Yes, that was to say, he had enough responsibility to bear, but exactness and watchfulness were what was required of him, and actual work, manual labor, he had next to none. To change that signal, to trim those lights, and to turn this iron handle now and then, was all he had to do under that head. Regarding those many long and lonely hours of which I seemed to make much, he could only say that that the routine of his life had shaped itself into that form, and he had grown used to it. He had taught himself a language down here, if only to know it by sight and to have formed his own crude ideas of pronunciation could be called learning it. He had also worked at fractions and decimals and tried a little algebra, but he was, as he had been as a boy, a poor hand at figures. Was it necessary for him, when on duty, to always remain in that channel of damp air, and could he never rise into the sunshine from between those high stone walls? Why, that depended upon the times and circumstances. Under some conditions there would be less upon the line than under others, and the same held good as to certain hours of the day and night. In bright weather he did choose occasions for getting a little above those lower shadows, but being at all times liable to be called by his electric bell, and at such times listening for it with redoubled anxiety, the relief was rather less than I would expect. He took me into his box, where there was a fire, a desk for an official book in which he had to make certain entries, a telegraphic instrument with its dial, base, and needles, and the little bell of which he had spoken. On my trusting he would excuse the remark that he had been well educated, and I hoped I might say so without offence, perhaps educated above this station, he observed that instances of slight incongruity in such wise would rarely be found wanting among large bodies of men. He had heard it was so in workhouses, in the police force, even in that last desperate resource, the army, and that he knew it was so, more or less, in any great railway staff. He had been, when young, if I could believe it, sitting in that hut, he scarcely, a student of natural philosophy, and had attended lectures. But he had run wild and misused his opportunities, gone down and never risen again. He had no complaint to offer about that. He made his bed and he lay upon it. It was far too late to make another. All that I have here condensed he said in a quiet manner, with his grave dark regards divided between me and the fire. He threw in the word "sir" from time to time, and especially when he referred to his youth, as though to request me to understand that he claimed to be nothing but what I found him. He was several times interrupted by the little bell, and had to read off messages and send replies. Once he had to stand without the door and display a flag as a train passed, and make some verbal communication to the driver. In the discharge of his duties, I observed him to be remarkably exact and vigilant, breaking off his discourse at a syllable, and remaining silent until he had to do what was done. In a word, I should have set this man down as one of the safest men to be employed in that capacity, but for the circumstance that while he was speaking to me he twice broke off with a fallen color, turned his face towards the little bell when it did not ring, opened the door of the hut, which was kept shut to exclude the unhealthy damp, and looked out towards the red light near the rear of the tunnel. On both occasions he came back to the fire with the inexplicable air upon him which I had remarked, without being able to define when we were so far asunder. Said I, when I rose to leave him, "You almost make me think that I have met with a contented man." I am afraid I must acknowledge that I said that to lead him on. "I believe I used to be so," he rejoined in the low voice in which he had first spoken. "But I am troubled, sir. I am troubled." He would have quickly recalled the words if he could. He had said them, however, and I took them up quickly. "With what? What is your trouble?" "It is very difficult to impart, sir. It is very difficult to speak of. If you ever make me another visit, I will try to tell you." "But I expressly intend to make another visit." "Say, when shall it be?" "I go off early in the morning, and I shall be on again at 10 tomorrow night, sir." "I will come at 11." He thanked me and went at the door with me. "I'll show my white light, sir," he said, in his peculiar low voice, "till you have found the way up. When you have found it, don't call out, and when you are at the top, don't call out." His manner seemed to make the place strike colder to me, but I said no more than, "Very well. And when you come down tomorrow night, don't call out. Let me ask you a parting question. What made you cry, 'Halloa, below there,' tonight?" "Heaven knows," I said. "I cried something to that effect." "Not to that effect, sir. Those were the very words. I know them well." "Admit those were the very words. I said them, no doubt, because I saw you below." "For no other reason?" "What other reason could I possibly have?" "You had no feeling that they were conveyed to you in any supernatural way?" "No." He wished me good night, and held up his light. I walked by the side of the down line of the rails, with a very disagreeable sensation of a train coming behind me, until I found the path. It was easier to mount than to descend, and I got back to my inn without any adventure. Punctual to my appointment, I placed my foot on the first notch of the zigzag next night, as the distant clocks were striking 11. He was waiting at the bottom, with his white light on. "I have not called out," I said, when we came close together. "May I speak now?" "By all means, sir." "Good night, then. And here's my hand." "Good night, sir. Here's mine." With that, we walked side by side to his box, entered it, closed the door, and sat down by the fire. "I have made up my mind, sir," he began, bending forward as soon as we were seated, and speaking in a tone but a little above a whisper. that you shall not have to ask me twice what troubles me. I took you for someone else yesterday evening. That troubles me. That mistake? No, that's someone else. Who is it? I don't know. Like me? I don't know. I never saw the face. The left arm is across the face, and the right arm is waved violently. This way. I followed the action with my eyes, and it was the action of an arm gesticulating with the utmost passion and vehemence. For God's sake, clear the way. One moonlight night, said the man. I was sitting here when I heard a voice cry, Halloa, below there. I started up, looked from that door, and saw this someone else standing by the red light near the tunnel, waving as I just now showed you. The voice seemed hoarse with shouting, and it cried, Look out, look out! And then again, Halloa, below there, look out! I caught up my lamp, turned it on red, and ran towards the figure, calling, What's wrong? What has happened? Where? It stood just outside the blackness of the tunnel. I advanced so close upon it that I wondered at its keeping the sleeve across its eyes. I ran right up at it and had my hand stretched out to pull the sleeve away. When it was gone. Into the tunnel? Said I. No. I ran onto the tunnel. 500 yards. I stopped and held my lamp above my head, and saw the figures of the measured distance, and saw the wet stain stealing down the walls and trickling through the arch. I ran out again faster than I had run in, for I had a moral abhorrence of the place upon me. And I looked all round with the red light of my own red light, and I went up the iron ladder to the gallery atop it, and I came down again, and ran back here. I telegraphed both ways. An alarm has been given. Is anything wrong? The answer came back both ways. All's well. Resisting the slow touch of a frozen finger tracing out my spine, I showed him how this figure must be a deception of his sense of sight, and how that figures originating in the disease of the delicate nerves that minister to the function of the eye were known often to have troubled patients, some of whom had become conscious of their nature of their affliction, and even proved it by experiments upon themselves. As to an imaginary cry, said I, do but listen for a moment to the wind in the unnatural valley while we speak so low, and to the wild harp it makes of the telegraph wires. That was all very well, he returned, after we had sat listening for a while, and he ought to know something of the wind on the wires, he who had so often passed long winter nights there alone and watching. But he would beg to remark that he had not finished. I asked his pardon, and slowly he added these words, touching my arm. Within 6 hours of the appearance, a memorable accident on this line had happened, and within 10 hours the dead and wounded were being brought along through the tunnel over the spot where the figure had stood. A disagreeable shudder crept over me, but I did my best against it. It would not be denied, I rejoined, that this was a remarkable coincidence, calculated deeply to impress his mind. It was unquestionable that remarkable coincidences did continually occur, and must be taken into account when dealing with such a subject. Though to be sure, I must admit, I added, for I thought that he was going to bring the objection to bear upon me, men of common sense did not allow much for coincidences in making the ordinary calculations of life. He again begged to remark that he had not finished. I again begged his pardon for being betrayed into interruptions. This, he said, again laying his hand upon my arm, and glancing over his shoulder with hollow eyes, was just a year ago. 6 or 7 months passed, and I recovered from the surprise and shock, when one morning, as the day was breaking, I was standing at the door, looked towards the red light, and saw the spectre again. He stopped with a fixed look at me. Did it cry out? No, it was silent. Did it wave its arm? No. It leaned against the shaft of the light with both hands before its face, like this. Once more I followed his action with my eyes. It was an action of mourning. I have seen such attitude in stone figures on tombs. Did you go up to it? I came in and sat down partly to collect my thoughts, partly because it had turned me faint. When I went to the door again, daylight was above me, and the ghost was gone. But nothing followed. Nothing came of this. He touched me on the arm with his forefinger twice or thrice, giving a ghastly nod each time. That very day, a train came out of the tunnel. I noticed at a carriage window on my side what looked like a confusion of hands and heads, and something waved. I saw it just in time to signal the driver. Stop! He shut off and put his brake on. The train drifted past here 150 yards or more. I ran after it. As I went along, I heard terrible screams and cries. A beautiful young lady had died instantaneously in one of the compartments and was brought here and laid down on this floor between us. I involuntarily pushed my chair back. I looked at the boards at which he pointed to himself. True, sir, true. Precisely as it happened, so I tell you. I could think of nothing to say to any purpose. My mouth was very dry. The wind and the wires took up the story with a long, lamenting wail. He resumed. Now mark this, sir, and judge how my mind is troubled. The spectre came back a week ago. Ever since it has been there, now and again, by fits and starts. At the light, at the danger light. What does it seem to do? He repeated, if possible, with increased passion and vehemence, that former gesticulation of, for God's sake, clear the way. Then he went on. I have no peace or rest for it. It calls to me for many minutes together, in an agonized manner. Below there, look out, look out. It stands waving to me. It rings my little bell. I caught at that. Did it ring your bell yesterday evening when I was here and you went to the door? Twice. Why, see, said I, how your imagination misleads you. My eyes were on the bell and my ears were open to the bell. If I am a living man, it did not ring those times, nor at any other time, except when it was rung in the natural course of physical things by the station communicating with you. He shook his head. I have never made a mistake as to that yet, sir. I have never confused the spectre's ring with the man's. The ghost's ring is a strange vibration in the bell that it derives from nothing else, and I have not asserted that the bell stirs to the eye. I don't wonder that you failed to hear it, but I heard it. And did the spectre seem to be there when you looked out? It was there. Both times? He repeated firmly. Both times. Will you come to the door with me and look for it now? He bit under his lip as though he were somewhat unwilling, but arose. I opened the door and stood on the top step, well, in the doorway. There was the danger light. There was the dismal mouth of the tunnel. There were the high, wet stone walls of the cutting. There were the stars above them. Do you see it? I asked him, taking particular note of his face. His eyes were prominent and strained, but not very much so, perhaps, more than mine own had been when I had directed them earnestly towards the same spot. No, he answered, it is not there. Agreed, said I. We went in again, shut the door, and resumed our seats. I was thinking how best to improve this advantage, if it might be called one, when he took up the conversation in such a matter-of-course way, so assuming that there could be no serious question of fact between us, that I felt myself placed in the weakest of positions. Well, this time you will fully understand, sir, he said, that what troubles me so dreadfully is the question, what does the spectre mean? I was not sure, I told him, I fully understood. What is its warning against? He said, ruminating, with his eyes on fire, and only by times turning them on me. What is the danger? Where is the danger? There is danger overhanging somewhere on the line. Some dreadful calamity will happen. It's not to be doubted this third time, after what has gone before. But surely this is a cruel haunting of me. What can I do? He pulled out his handkerchief and wiped the drops from his heated forehead. If I telegraph danger on either side of me, or on both, I can give no reason for it, he went on, wiping the palms of his hands. I should get into trouble and do no good. They would think I was mad. This is the way it would work. Message. Danger. Take care. Answer. What danger? Where? Message. Don't know. But for God's sake, take care. They would displace me. What else could they do? His pain of mind was pitiable to see. It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life. When it first stood under the danger light, he went on, putting his dark hair back from his head and drawing his hands outward across and across his temples in an extremity of feverish distress. Why not tell me where that accident was to happen, if it must happen? Why not tell me how it could be averted, if it could have been averted? When on its second coming it hit its face, why not tell me instead, she is going to die? let them keep her at home. If it came on those 2 occasions only to show me that its warnings were true, and to so prepare me for the third, why not warn me plainly now? And I, Lord help me, a mere poor signalman on solitary station. Why not go to someone with credit to be believed and power to act? When I saw him in this state, I saw that for the poor man's sake, as well as for the public safety, what I had to do for the time was to compose his mind. Therefore, setting aside all question of reality or unreality between us, I represented to him that whoever thoroughly discharged his duty must do well, and that at least it was his comfort that he understood his duty, though he did not understand these confounding appearances. In this effort I succeeded far better than in the attempt to reason him out of his conviction. He became calm. The occupations incidental to his post as the night advanced began to make larger demands on his attention, and I left him at 2 in the morning. I had offered to stay through the night, but he would not hear it. That I once more looked back on the red light as I ascended the pathway, that I did not like the red light, and that I should have slept poorly if my bed had been under it, I see no reason to conceal. Nor did I like the 2 sequences of the accident and the dead girl. I see no reason to conceal that either. But what ran through most in my thoughts was the consideration of how I ought to act. Having become the recipient of this disclosure, I had proved the man to be intelligent, vigilant, painstaking, and exact. How long might he remain so in this state of mind? Though in a subordinate position, he still held a most important trust. Would I, for instance, like to stake my own life on the chances of his continuing to execute it with precision? Unable to overcome a feeling that there would be something treacherous in my communicating what he had told me to his superiors in the company, without being first plain with himself and proposing a middle course to him, I ultimately resolved to offer to accompany him, otherwise keeping his secret for the present, the wisest medical practitioner we could hear of in these parts, and to take his opinion. A change in his time of duty would come around the next night, he had apprised me, and he would be off an hour or 2 after sunrise, and on again soon after sunset. I had appointed to return accordingly. Next evening was a lovely evening. I walked out early to enjoy it. The sun was not yet quite down when I traversed the field path near the top of the deep cutting. I would extend my walk for an hour, I said to myself, half an hour on and half an hour back, and it would by then be time to go to my signalman's box. Before pursuing my stroll, I stepped to the brink and mechanically looked down from the point which I had first seen him. I cannot describe the thrill that seized upon me. When close at the mouth of the tunnel, I saw the appearance of a man, with his left sleeve across his eyes, passionately waving his right arm. Nameless horror that oppressed me passed in a moment, for I saw that this appearance of a man was a man indeed, and that there was a little group of other men standing at a short distance, to whom he seemed to be rehearsing the gesture he made. The danger light was not yet lighted. Against its shaft, a low little hut, entirely new to me, had been made from some wooden supports and a tarpaulin. It looked no bigger than a bed. With an irresistible sense that something was wrong, with a flashing, self-reproachful fear that fatal mischief had come of my leaving the man there, and causing no one to be sent to overlook or correct what he did, I descended the notched path with all the speed I could make. "What is the matter?" I asked the men. "Signalman killed this morning, sir." "Not the man belonging to that box?" "Yes, sir." "Not the man I know?" "You will recognize him, sir, if you knew him," said the man who spoke for the others, solemnly uncovering his own head and raising an end of the tarpaulin, "for his face is quite composed." "Oh, how did this happen? How did this happen?" I asked him, turning from one to another as the hut closed in again. "He was cut down by an engine, sir. No man in England knew his work better, but somehow he was not clear of the outer rail. It was just at broad day. He had struck the light and had the lamp in his hand. As the engine came out of the tunnel, his back was towards her, and she cut him down. That man drove her, and was showing how it happened. Show the gentleman, Tom." The man, who wore a rough, dark dress, stepped back to his former place at the mouth of the tunnel. "Coming round the curve in the tunnel, sir," he said. "I saw him at the end, like as I saw him coming down a perspective glass. There was no time to check speed, and I knew him to be very careful, and he didn't seem to take heed of the whistle. I shut it off when we were running down upon him, and I called to him as loud as I could call." "What did you say?" "I said, 'Hello there! Look out! Look out! For God's sake, clear the way!'" I started. Ah, it was a dreadful time, sir. I never left off calling to him. I put this arm before my eyes not to see, and I waved this arm to the last. But it was no use. Without prolonging the narrative to dwell on any one of its curious circumstances more than any other, I may, in closing it, point out the coincidence that the warning of the engine driver included not only the words which the unfortunate signalman had repeated to me as haunting him, but also the words which I myself, not he, had attached and that only haunted my mind to the gesticulation he had made. The Man of Science, 1892, Jerome K. Jerome. I met a man in the Strand one day that I knew very well, as I thought, though I had not seen him for years. We walked together to Charing Cross, and there we shook hands and parted. Next morning I spoke of this meeting to a mutual friend, and then I learnt, for the first time, that the man had died 6 months before. The natural inference was that I had mistaken one man for another, an error that, not having a good memory for faces, I frequently fall into. What was remarkable about the matter, however, was that throughout our walk I had conversed with the man under the impression that he was the other dead man, and whether by coincidence or not, his replies had never once suggested to me my mistake. As soon as I finished, Jeffson, who had been listening very thoughtfully, asked me if I believed in spiritualism to its fullest extent. That is a rather large question, I answered. What do you mean by spiritualism to its fullest extent? Well, do you believe that the spirits of the dead have not only the power of revisiting this earth at their will, but that when here, they have the power of action, or rather of exciting to action? Let me put a definite case. A spiritualist friend of mine, a sensible and by no means imaginative man, once told me that a table, through the medium of which the spirit of a friend had been in the habit of communicating with him, came slowly across the room towards him, of its own accord, one night, as he sat alone, and pinioned him against the wall. Now, can any of you believe that, or can't you? I could, Brown took it upon himself to reply. But before doing so, I should wish for an introduction to the friend of yours who told the story. Speaking generally, he continued, it seems to me that the difference between what we call the natural and the supernatural is merely the difference between frequency and rarity of occurrence. Having regard to the phenomenon, as we are compelled to admit, I think it illogical to disbelieve anything we are unable to disprove. For my part, remarked McShaughnessy, I can believe in the ability of our spirit friends to give the quaint entertainment credited to them much easier than I can in their desire to do so. You mean, added Jeffson, that you cannot understand why a spirit, not compelled as we are by the exigencies of society, would care to spend its evenings carrying on a labored and childish conversation with a room full of abnormally uninteresting people. That is precisely what I cannot understand, McShaughnessy agreed. Nor I either, said Jeffson. But I was thinking of something very different altogether. Suppose a man died with the dearest wish of his heart unfulfilled. You believe that his spirit would have the power to return to earth and complete the interrupted work. Well, answered McShaughnessy, if one admits the possibility of spirits retaining any interest in the affairs of this world at all, it is certainly more reasonable to imagine them engaged upon a task such as you suggest than to believe that they occupy themselves with the performance of mere drawing-room tricks. What are you leading up to? Why, to this, replied Jeffson, seating himself straddle-legged across his chair and leaning with his arms upon its back. I was told a story this morning at the hospital by an old French doctor. The actual facts are few and simple. All that is known can be read in the Paris police reports of 62 years ago. The important part of the case, however, is the part that is not known, and that never will be known. The story begins with a great wrong done by one man unto another. What the wrong is I do not know, but I am inclined to think, however, that it was connected with a woman. I think that, because he who had been wronged hated him who had wronged him, with such a hate as does not often burn in a man's brain, unless it be fanned by the memory of a woman's breath. Still, that is only conjecture, and the point is immaterial. The man who had done the wrong fled, and the other man followed him. It became a point-to-point race, the first man having the advantage of a day's start. The course was the whole world, and the stakes were the first man's life. Travelers were few and far between in those days, and this made the trail easy to follow. The first man, never knowing how far or how near the other was behind him, and hoping now and again that he might have baffled him, would rest for a while. The second man, knowing always just how far the first one was before him, never paused, and thus each day the man who was spurred by hate drew nearer to the man who was spurred by fear. At this town, the answer to the never varied question would be, "At 7 o'clock last evening, monsieur." 18 hours. Give me something to eat while the horses are being put to. At the next, the calculation would be 16 hours. Passing a lonely chalet, monsieur puts his head out of a window. How long since the carriage passed its way with a tall, fair man inside? Such a one passed early this morning, monsieur. Thanks. Drive on. 100 francs apiece if you are through the pass before daybreak. And what for the dead horses, monsieur? Twice their value while living. One day, the man who was ridden by fear looked up, and saw before him the open door of a cathedral, and, passing in, knelt down and prayed. He prayed long and fervently for men, when they are in sore straits, clutch eagerly at the straws of faith. He prayed that he might be forgiven his sin, and, more importantly still, that he might be pardoned from the consequences of his sin, and delivered from his adversary. And a few chairs from him, facing him, knelt his enemy, praying also. But the second man's prayer, being merely a thanksgiving, was short, so that when the first man raised his eyes, he saw the face of his enemy gazing upon him across the chair tops with a mocking smile upon it. He made no attempt to rise, but remained kneeling, fascinated by the look of joy that shone out of the other man's eyes. And the other man moved the high-backed chairs one by one and came towards him softly. Then, just as the man who had been wronged stood beside the man who had wronged him, full of gladness that his opportunity had come, there burst from the cathedral tower a sudden clash of bells, and the man, whose opportunity had come, broke his heart and fell back dead, that mocking smile still playing round his mouth. And so he lay there. Then the man who had done the wrong rose up and passed out, thanking God. What became of the body of the other man is not known. It was the body of a stranger who had died suddenly in the cathedral. There was none to identify it, none to claim it. Years passed away, and the survivor in the tragedy became a worthy and useful citizen and a noted man of science. In his laboratory were many objects necessary to him in his researches, and prominent among them stood in a certain corner a human skeleton. It was a very old and much mended skeleton, and one day the long-expected end arrived, and it tumbled to pieces. Thus it became necessary to purchase another. The man of science visited a dealer he knew well, a little parchment-faced old man who kept a dingy shop where nothing was ever sold, in the shadow of the towers of Notre Dame. The little parchment-faced man had just the very thing for that monsieur wanted, a singularly fine and well-proportioned study. It should be sent round and set up in monsieur's laboratory that very afternoon. The dealer was as good as his word. When monsieur entered his laboratory that evening, the thing was in its place. Monsieur seated himself in his high-backed chair and tried to collect his thoughts. But monsieur's thoughts were unruly and inclined to wander, and to wander always in one direction. Monsieur opened a large volume and commenced to read. He read of a man who had wronged another man and fled from him, the other man following. Finding himself reading this, he closed the book angrily, and went and stood by the window and looked out. He saw before him the sun-pierced nave of the great cathedral, and on the stones lay a dead man with a mocking smile upon his face. Cursing himself for a fool, he turned away with a laugh. But his laugh was short-lived, for it seemed to him that something else in the room was laughing also. Struck suddenly still, with his feet glued to the ground, he stood listening for a while, then sought with starting eyes the corner from where the sound had seemed to come. But the white thing standing there was only grinning. Monsieur wiped the damp sweat from his head and hands, and stole out. For a couple of days he did not enter the room again. On the third, telling himself that his fears were those of a hysterical girl, he opened the door and went in. To shame himself, he took his lamp in his hand, and crossing over to the far corner where the skeleton stood, examined it. A set of bones bought for 300 francs. Was he a child to be scared of such a bogey? He held his lamp in front of him, in front of the thing's grinning head. The flame of the lamp flickered, as though a faint breath had passed over it. The man explained this to himself by saying that the walls of the old house were cracked, and wind might creep in anywhere. He repeated this explanation to himself as he recrossed the room, walking backwards, with his eyes fixed on the thing. When he reached his desk, he sat down and gripped the arms of his chair till his fingers turned white. He tried to work, but the empty sockets in that grinning head seemed to be drawing him towards them. He rose and battled with his inclination to fly screaming from the room. Glancing fearfully around him, his eye fell upon a high screen. Standing before the door, he dragged it forward and placed it between himself and the thing, so that he could not see it, or it him. Then he sat down again to his work. For a while he forced himself to look at the book in front of him, but at last, unable to control himself any longer, he suffered his eyes to follow their own bent. It may have been a hallucination. He may have accidentally placed the screen so as to favor such an illusion, but what he saw was a bony hand coming around the corner of the screen, and with a cry he fell to the floor in a swoon. The people of the house came running in, and lifting him up, carried him out, and laid him upon his bed. As soon as he recovered, his first question was, where had they found the thing? Where was it when they had entered the room? And when they told him that they had seen it standing where it always stood, and had gone down into the room to look again because of its frenzied entreaties, and returned trying to hide their smiles, he listened to their talk about overwork and the necessity for change and rest, and said they might do with him as they would. But for many months the laboratory door remained locked. Then there came a chill autumn evening, when the main man of science opened it again, and closed it behind him. He lighted his lamp and gathered his instruments and books around him, and sat down before them in his high-backed chair, and the old terror returned to him. But this time he meant to conquer himself. His nerves were stronger now, and his brain clearer. He would fight his unreasoning fear. He crossed to the door and locked himself in, and flung the key to the other end of the room, where it fell among jars and bottles with an echoing clatter. Later on, his old housekeeper, going her final round, tapped on his door and wished him good night, as was her custom. She received no response at first, and growing nervous, tapped louder and called again. At length, an answering "Good night" came back to her. She thought little about it at the time, but afterwards she remembered that the voice that had replied to her had been strangely grating and mechanical. Trying to describe it, she likened it to such a voice as she would imagine coming from a statue. Next morning, his door still remained locked. It was no unusual thing for him to work all night and far into the next day, so no one thought to be surprised. When, however, evening came and he did not yet appear, the servants gathered outside the room and whispered, remembering what had happened once before. They listened but could hear no sound. They shook the door and called to him, and beat it with their fists upon the wooden panels, but still no sound came from the room. Becoming alarmed, they decided to burst open the door, and after many blows, it gave way and they crowded in. He sat bolt upright in his high-backed chair. They thought at first he had died in his sleep, but when they drew nearer and the light fell upon him, they saw the livid marks of bony fingers round his throat, and in his eyes there was such terror as is not often seen in human eyes. Brown was the first to break the silence that followed. He asked me if I had any brandy on board. He said he felt like he should just have a nip of brandy before going to bed. That is one of the chief charms of Jephson's stories. They always make you feel you want a little brandy. The end. Those are our stories for today. Thank you again for attending this Pierce County Library System virtual program. We hope you enjoyed it. I'd like to take this opportunity also to remind you that while our library buildings are currently closed to the public in order to help reduce the spread of COVID-19, we do encourage you to place holds on books and movies and CDs and any other materials you might like through our online catalog and pick them up using our library curbside service, which is available at a Pierce County Library branch near you. You can learn more by visiting its dedicated website at curbside.pcls.us. That is curbside.pcls.us. Thank you again for joining us.